All right, here we are. Sorry for the delay. For the sneak preview, and we'll go back that direction. All right, here we are, and welcome everybody in person and on Zoom to our first lunch and learn of the year. And we are excited to have Dr. Anya Foxen joining us. I will talk about her in a minute. First, a couple of upcoming events. Our next lunch and learn is on October 6th. Same time, different place. So sign up and you will get a link for that. Maybe same food. If you're here, Ben Williams from Naropa University is going to talk about classical tantric yoga and the aphorisms of Shiva. So please join us for that. We also have a bunch of exciting things coming up. After this, if you have signed up to be here, you will get an email which has links to all of these things. We have a lot of continuing ed courses coming up. A course on the Yoga Sutras, one on addiction and recovery, which starts tomorrow. One on mindfulness and social change, one on Buddhist mindfulness, and more. We have monthly info sessions for anybody who's interested in learning more about our master's program. Also, I should introduce myself. I'm Zoe Sladoff. I am now the Associate Director of the Yoga Studies program. If you want to learn more about the program, you can also call me and make an appointment to talk to me online. Also, to put in your calendar, Yoga Day, Saturday, November 8th, we have a full day of fun things. Our theme is reimagining the guru, and we're going to have interesting discussions and music and yoga, of course. So even those of you on Zoom, it's a good time to come in person and join us. I think that's it. So, yes, I would like to introduce Dr. Anya Foxen. She is a historian and comparativist scholar of religion. She earned her PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is an associate professor of religious studies at Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo, as well as a research associate at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University, although she lives in Santa Barbara, and I just learned commutes a lot more than I do. So my commute now feels short. Her scholarly research focuses on the intersection of South Asian yogic and tantric traditions with Western esotericism and metaphysical spiritualities. Her special areas of interest include embodiment, which we've talked a lot about in class, for those of you in my class, and as well as the interplay of religion and science. She's also a longtime practitioner and teacher of yoga. She is the co-author of Is This Yoga, which we've been reading in our undergrad traditions of yoga class, so she's kind of a celebrity here. We read her book in my grad class also, and her talk today is actually comes from her forthcoming book, end of September.
Yeah, I think it's out.
Put it out, amazing! Yay, that's exciting. Okay, so her book, The Serpent's Tale: Kundalini Yoga and the History of an Experience, which he co-wrote with Shravana Bhargava. And yeah, I can't wait to read it. And so her talk today is entitled The Importance of Rousing Serpents. Let me just see if I can go away, see if I can get. And I will turn it over to her to tell us more about things.
These people want to picture themselves eating and drinking.
Zoe, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for having me. Chris, Zoe.
Pardon me. Excuse me. I hate to interrupt. Can you mute everyone because we're getting feedback?
In here. You should now be able to go back.
There we go. Okay. Okay. Starting over. Hi everyone. So this is what we'll be talking about today, and I'm going to try to keep it as sort of foundational and entry level as possible because I'm aware that not everybody in the audience may be aware of what Kundalini even is. So we're going to sort of scaffold a little bit, hopefully. as Zoe just said, this talk comes out of a book that my dear friend and colleague Shravana Burkatama and I recently wrote. I think it's out. I don't have a physical copy of it. I think it's actually my fault. So if y'all want to go on like a really nerdy deep dive of all this stuff, it's in the book. But I'm going to give you sort of one storyline that exists in that work, which deals with how Kundalini is actually sort of central to that early transmission of modern yoga into the West in ways that we maybe don't even realize today because it's kind of sank below the surface. And so basically what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about what Kundalini is and the sort of basic origins of this concept in South Asia. And then I'm going to very quickly fast forward to like the late 19th century and essentially proceed from there, because this is where we really see this kind of synthesis that gives us modern yoga emerge. So let's see if I can actually, perfect, okay. So as I said, that's the book. And the book does mostly deal with kind of this more modern period. So a lot of the threads that I'll be picking up on here will kind of come from that portion of things. There's two things that I mainly want to accomplish today. One is more specific, the other one's a little bit more broad in terms of like the argument that I'm trying to make to y'all. And so the more specific argument is that Kundalini was really sort of central to not just the formation of modern yoga in general, but the teachings of these two gurus that we don't often associate with Kundalini in particular. And those are Swami Vivekananda on the other hand, and Paramahansa Yogananda on the other. So we'll be looking for what it is that they're doing with Kundalini. The broader argument deals with kind of how we think about modern yoga in relation to pre-modern yoga, and where we can kind of see these points of continuity and change. So those of you that are familiar with the field of yoga studies probably have heard of Mark Singleton's book, Yoga Body. It sort of revolutionized the field of yoga studies in a very, very important way, right? And part of that was to sort of break this narrative that there's something sort of deeply ancient about the form of yoga that we're doing today when it comes to physical postures. Now, Singleton has sort of revised his thesis a little bit along with some of his colleagues to show that actually we do see complex forms of what he said in that book. But generally speaking, right, like part of the argument that he was trying to make and part of why it was so kind of transformative and also in a sense difficult for people was that he essentially said that, look, this stuff that we call yoga today, right, modern postural yoga, isn't really any more similar to the medieval synthesis that's called hatha yoga, right? This sort of more physical stuff. It's no more similar to that on some level than it is to what's going on in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, where there's only one sutra that's even really devoted to asana. And that's kind of a tough pill to swallow, right? That there's sort of like no tradition to what it is that we're doing today. Now, that's obviously an overstatement, right? And that's not actually what Singleton was trying to do. But part of the bigger story that I want to try to tell today is that if we're looking for continuity in the history of yoga, in this narrative of yoga, of what it is and where it comes from, it might actually be more useful to think about this conceptually rather than in terms of just like the literal physical stuff that it is we're doing. So it's not necessarily kind of how we're moving the body that shows this continuity. It's why we're moving the body or why we're doing anything with the body or with ourselves at all. And how it is that this is linked to this kind of narrative of not just transcendence, but self-perfection, which is where the Kundalini piece really plugs in. So let's just do like a really quick overview of what Kundalini is. So eventually I'll master the keyboard and the mouse here. The tricky thing about what Kundalini is that it's not any one thing. And it's specifically not any one thing if you're just trying to track the term rather than the concept. You'll notice this is going to be sort of like a, you know, a comeback or a a phrase that I'll return to, right? It's the concepts, it's not the literal form of the thing. So if we track the concept of Kundalini, this idea that there's some energy that rises within the body, that leads to maybe these higher forms of consciousness, to these states of transcendence, that concept goes back a long way. Now, what varies, as Mark Singleton and James Mallinson have pointed out in their work, is what that thing is called, right? Because sometimes it's Kundalini, but actually it's not Kundalini until fairly late on. Sometimes it's prana, sometimes it's any one of these other things, Bindu, what have you. And then on the other hand, if we look at where Kundalini pops up, starting in roughly the 8th to 9th century CE in the medieval literature, we see a lot of ambiguity as far as what it is, where it rests, what it does or doesn't do. So the title of today's talk, The Importance of Rousing Serpents, as well as the title of the book, kind of comes from this image that Kundalini has been associated with really for a long time, but really especially in terms of global understandings only since 1919, when Arthur Avalon, who is actually sort of not one person, but multiple, released this book called The Serpent Power. Now, The Serpent Power is really interesting because although it was nominally authored by this sort of British colonial official named John Woodruff, who was sort of, publicly known to be behind the pseudonym of Arthur Avalon, Woodruff was actually working with a team of Bengali, not just scholars, but also practitioners of this stuff. So unlike some of the other texts that you might encounter during this time period that are written in English that purport to talk about Kundalini, the Serpent Power is actually sort of pretty traditional in how it depicts Kundalini. And a good portion of it is devoted to the translation of this particular text called the Shatchakra Nirodhana, which comes out of a very specific lineage that sort of places Kundalini front and center in terms of their model for how the world works and what we should be doing within it. So there's a reason that we have this kind of standard model of Kundalini today that in a sense maybe obscures some of the complications that we might find otherwise if we were to just look at the pre-modern literature on its own. So I want to give us a little bit of an overview of what those complications are, because actually part of this I think is really key to understanding why, especially in some lineages, Kundalini is really not centered in modern postural yoga today. But for our intents and purposes, when we're going to be looking at Vivekananda and when we're going to be looking at Yogananda, it's more the model that you'll find in the Serpent Power that's going to be kind of what they're assuming. And this is as if you know anything about kind of Tantra or sort of chakras or anything like that, right? It's become so standardized that it's almost sort of second nature for us to revert to this. So Kundalini first begins to pop up as a distinct term that's mentioned in Sanskrit, the Sanskrit literature around the 8th century. Now, immediately there is this sort of, as I said, ambiguity around what it is, including where it's even found. Some texts will talk about it as a coil in the heart. Kundalini, of course, just simply means she who is coiled. Some will talk about it in the lower abdomen. Others will talk about it in the way that becomes ultimately kind of the standard at the base of the spine. But from the very beginning, right, there is this sort of range of options when it comes to like, what are we even talking about, right? Where is it in the body, if it's in the body at all? And so this is the other crucial thing, right? Insofar as Kundalini is something that is in the body, it's conceived in ways that you might think are actually sort of polar opposites to one another. Some texts, notably texts that lean in this more sort of ascetic direction, and ones that are interestingly associated more with Vaishnava lineages than Shaiva lineages, tend to, when they talk about Kundalini, treat it as an obstruction. So it's some sort of, like the reason that it's coiled, right, and that's relevant, is that it functions almost as like a knot that keeps your energy from rising. So it's not Kundalini itself that rises. You have to sort of unwind Kundalini, right? So that the thing that you want to rise actually does end up rising. And usually, again, that's prana or whatever. On the other hand, and this is sort of the more common model, although again, if you're talking about the pre-modern literature, things are really blurry, right? But on the other hand, there is this model that actually ends up being a lot more elaborate that places Kundalini like front and center in their cosmologies, where it is the energy within the body that is unwound, sort of straightened. This is where the image of the serpent comes from, right? Imagine like a cobra all coiled up, right? And then it rises to strike. Right, so once Kundalini rises, this actually leads to this transformation of consciousness, this transformation of the body. And actually, this is sort of key to how the whole universe is put together. Because Kundalini in these traditions is ultimately equated with like ultimate reality, right? Kundalini is not just an energy by virtue of being an energy, by virtue of being Shakti, it is the goddess. And especially in those traditions where the goddess is kind of like the one that's at the top of everything. So yes, it's Shiva Shakti, but it's Shakti maybe that we care about a little bit more. This thing that is in your body is also the thing that is literally the entire world, right? Which is kind of a big deal. So that version of what Kundalini is, we find fairly early on in tantric texts, where the model for what this all looks like within the body, of how this works, insofar it's based in practice, it's based more in practice of visualization, right? So the chakras, as some scholars have argued, are not sort of originally physical points in the body, right? We often talk about them as energy centers today. This psychophysical scaffolding for how it is that we work with the divine energies that suffuse the body in order to affect this kind of change that ultimately leads to enlightenment and to transcendence. Now, I'm obviously oversimplifying things quite a bit here, right? But the same thing should be applied to Kundalini. Yes, Kundalini is within the body, but insofar as Kundalini is also the goddess, right? It's not like the goddess is just like sitting in your body. This is something that you have to sort of construct for yourself to really transform your mind, your intellect in such a way that it sort of acknowledges its oneness with this ultimate reality. So around the 13th century of the Common Era, this is, again, James Mallinson's argument, we begin to see this new thing emerge that's called Hatha Yoga. Mallinson calls this classical Hatha Yoga because it's sort of the thing that you find first in these in this Sanskrit literature. And to give you sort of a very basic version of how this all works, within classical Hatha Yoga, what we find are physical methods of practice, whether that's pranayama, breath control, whether it's these other sort of maybe even more physical methods that Mallinson isolates as being really the defining characteristics of Hatha Yoga. So bandhas, mudras, right? Locks within the body, maybe different sort of seals, right? Whether with the hands or with something else that you can actually physically perform. These are for the first time sort of associated with this process of trying to awaken and raise Kundalini. Now, Mallinson, as scholars do, right, has also sort of gone on to refine this thesis a little bit. Initially, he argued that these were things that were found amongst ascetic lineages that maybe had been practiced for centuries without being written down. And so what's really new in the 13th century is that these are being applied to the sort of tantric concept of Kundalini for the first time. Now he's like, well, I mean, like you'd think you'd see more evidence of these things if they were really practiced for a millennium, and I can't find the evidence, so maybe I need to walk it back a little bit. But I think overall, the broad strokes of his arguments still stand. Right. And this for us, I think, is helpful to think with because it gives us an example, even in the 13th century, of how two different systems were woven together to form some kind of semi-new form of practice, right? That these maybe ascetic physical techniques come together with this tantric sort of method of visualization, this cosmology, to now give us a model of the body where, yes, there's these sort of visionary meditative realities that come together, but we use the physical body to sort of manipulate how those realities manifest in our physiology on an energetic level. So at this point, let's go ahead and fast forward a couple of, maybe more than a couple of, like 7 centuries here, basically. Before we do that, the sort of overview of the 7 centuries I'll give you is as follows. There's a lot of reasons for why yogis like Yogananda or Vivekananda don't call what they do Hatha Yoga, much less Tantra. If this was like a full-on class, right, we could talk about all of those very, very complicated realities. But for our intents and purposes, I think there's 2 that are really major. And they both have to do with the ways that both kind of historical factors that deal with what's going on internally, politically within South Asia, and also colonialism come together to sort of really shift the way that not only we're talking about what these terms, what these practices are, but the way that actually stuff looks on the ground, right? How all these traditions sort of interact to, again, blend and form new practices. So already by the time that British colonialism becomes sort of a serious point of concern, more kind of ritually based tantric models to maybe more devotionally based models that deal with experience in a slightly different way. We've also had a shift from sort of more tantric version of non-dualism, right? This idea that all of reality is somehow one, to a model that is more Vedantic, right? That's more based on the Upanishads and what's going on in there. Now, that's not to say that one replaces the other. It's never really that straightforward, right? Things don't just sort of like drop in to cover over each other completely. It's always a synthesis. It's always a blending. And so in some ways, when both Vivekananda and Yogananda talk about Vedanta, what they mean isn't really sort of Vedanta as it would have looked in the 10th century. They're talking about something that's already sort of brought in these various tantric understandings. And they're talking about something that isn't just based on, let's say, philosophical contemplation. At this point in the tradition, yogic methods, including these methods that are associated with Kundalini, have become sort of central to Vedanta in their own right. So that's one piece. On the other hand, as I said, there's this sort of very complicated thing going on with how both asceticism and tantra are understood by colonial authorities. Ascetics, for a lot of reasons, have a hard time of it under the colonial regime. They're basically sort of criminalized out of existence. And because of how the sort of ideology within this context is operating to paint certain things as good and certain things as bad, you don't necessarily want to be associated with the kind of like marauding ascetics if you're somebody like Vivekananda, who's trying to sell his brand of kind of neo-Vedanta on a global stage. When it comes to Tantra, things are even worse, right? Tantra, and Hugh Urban's done some excellent work on this, is essentially sort of not just criminalized, right? But it's like the worst thing that you could be doing. It's associated with illicit sex, it's associated with intoxication, it essentially gets called a perversion. For at least a century, if not more, around the time that Vivekananda and Yogananda would have been doing their work. So despite the fact that both sort of these originally ascetic methods of Hatha Yoga and Tantra are really central to what they're doing, they're smart men, right? It does not behoove them to necessarily call what they're doing those things outright. And some of that is strategic, right? Because they're operating in this colonial context. But some of that does, again, also go back to this blending that's already occurred. So let's look at what it is that really doesn't want me to change things. Okay, let's look at what it is that Vivekananda and Yogananda actually say. Vivekananda, for those of you that are somehow hearing of him for the first time, which I mean, I guess if you don't spend all your time reading nerdy yoga books, it's entirely realistic. Vivekananda is often named the father of modern yoga. This is maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but actually, given how influential he ends up being, it's not a bad assessment of what's going on. Vivekananda is Bengali and belongs to what we today know as the Ramakrishna mission. This is if you're familiar with the Vedanta societies, that's where the Vedanta societies sort of come out of. Most of them are started by people that essentially belong to Vivekananda's lineage, for lack of a better word. That lineage goes back to a mystic named Ramakrishna Paramahansa, who is sort of a very complicated figure in his own right. But at a very crucial moment, Ramakrishna becomes sort of central to Vivekananda's life, as well as to, you know, what it is that we can say about his own, I think, sort of spiritual practice and progress. Now, going into sort of details, right? Vivekananda, of course, names his initial organization that he establishes in the US, the Vedanta Society. Right? It's not the Tantra Society, it's not even the Yoga Society, it's the Vedanta Society. And that should be taken seriously. But if we look closely at what Vivekananda actually ends up teaching when he comes to the US, when he does his sort of lecture tour, and what he ultimately publishes, and this is really what a lot of his legacy is owed to, this book called Raja Yoga that first comes out in 1896, what he's actually sort of telling people to do has this kind of tantric Kundalini scaffolding to it. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. It's often said that Vivekananda did not teach physical yoga. Now, in some ways this is correct. Vivekananda was not teaching elaborate asana practice. But insofar as breath work is physical, his method is very, very physical, right? And so in this quote, we see an example of this. This is straight from Raja Yoga. What he's basically instructing his readers here, but what he would also instruct his students to do when he gave versions of this talk in public, is to fill the lungs, right? But in a very specific way. He's instructing alternate nostril breathing. If you look carefully at the terms that are being used here, he's talking about the Ida and Pingala nadis, right? These are classically the two sort of channels that run up and down the body within this particular genre of tantric hatha yogic literature. And so as you do your alternate nostril breathing, it's a very physical method. You inhale through one nostril, right? You exhale through the other. You're doing this very much with your body. You are also manipulating the energy as it flows in this sort of circuit almost form through the subtle body, through the sort of energy channels that control everything that goes on within the organism. And so why are we doing this? Well, because through this exercise, we end up striking at the last plexus, right? So now he's talking about nerve plexuses, but he really means chakras. That sort of base chakra, which is the seat of Kundalini. And through this kind of method, right, we end up sort of awakening this Kundalini power. Now, there's something else going on here, right? There's a reason that Vivekananda is using the language that he's using. There's a reason he calls that Muladhara chakra, right, that base chakra, a plexus. And then sort of, you know, a little bit more poetically, maybe a lotus rather than a chakra. Now, yes, he's writing in English, but if you look at the language that's actually being used here, this language of nerve currents, for instance, he's also very consciously updating what the terminology actually is and what it means. He's using modern science, contemporary science, and actually not a sort of bad understanding of it, given the sort of stage of that science at the time, to explain, to reinterpret what these realities within the body actually sort of look like and how they work. And so as we'll see, this is going to be pretty central to how it is that both he and Yogananda sort of update the teachings of the medieval texts, not only for their Western audiences, right, that maybe are a little bit more comfortable with scientific language, but also just sort of for the contemporary period, for the modern world in general. Part of what's going on here then is that Kundalini is becoming not only more associated with physical reality, right, but it's becoming a sort of biophysical mechanism. And so for both Vivekananda and Yogananda, we're going to see this take on two tracks. I don't know why it really likes that slide. Maybe it thinks I'm going too slowly. One is going to be the way that this is explained within the body through the language of electricity and kind of physics, essentially, right? Which is, of course, one version scientifically of what this might look like and what's going on here. So we won't dwell on this too much because I'll actually come back to this quote in a few minutes. But notice the way that Vivekananda talks about the way that rhythmic breathing, which for him here is a form of pranayama, affects what's going on within the body, right? So of course he's using the language now not only of nerve currents, but of electricity, this sort of subtle energy as it would have been understood at the time. Remember, we're at the end of the 19th century here. But the goal of all of this, as you sort of channel this electrical energy through your physiology, is again ultimately to sort of establish a particular control over your physiology, right? So he talks about the respiratory center being used to control the other centers. And here again, he sort of means chakras, right? He sort of means these quasi-visionary realities, but he also means just your little organs. And ultimately, the goal is to rouse, right, to awaken this coiled up power in the Muladhara, in the base chakra, called Kuṇḍalinī. So for Vivekananda, this becomes a consistent thing to which he returns. Here, so I'm taking this from Raja Yoga, but it's helpful to remember that Raja Yoga, this book, was actually sort of a collection of the public talks that he gave in large part. The other thing, though, that Raja Yoga is it's also commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And so it's really interesting to watch how Vivekananda sort of takes that text that's so central to a lot of yogic tradition and essentially gives it this half tantric, half modern scientific read, right? Because, there we go, that's the right slide. Not only is he using the language of science, this to a sort of very en vogue scientific concept at the time, which is the idea of evolution. So we can kind of see what's going on in the entirety of the quote here, but actually the important part is at the very, very bottom there. As he sort of begins to talk about evolution, which he interestingly plucks out of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras through some very, very interesting translation, just not the verses, but really the commentary. He is relying on this method that the book provides, this method of rousing Kundalini, to essentially speak to the way that audiences in his day would have understood the idea of bodily perfection, right? Which wouldn't have been happening necessarily just on the level of the individual, but would have now been understood as happening on the level of the entire species, right? So if you read him carefully, what he actually ends up doing is talking about a very specific version of evolution that's close to the neo-Darwinian synthesis that's emerging at this time, but it actually looks more like the forms of progressive evolution that would have been sort of competing with this Darwinian model in his day, where evolution is not just random, right? In fact, he says this very clearly early on in the quote, but actually evolution is building towards this goal of something sort of more perfect that is implicit in the structure of the cosmos. And so what he doesn't say here explicitly, but what is implicit to the text overall and to the teachings that he ultimately seeks to sort of disseminate within the West, is that it's the mechanism of Kundalini that actually helps us get there, right? That insofar as Kundalini has long been understood as this energy that transforms the body when it's awakened, that essentially leads you to these higher planes of not just awareness, but sort of bodily existence, right? Liberation while in the body. this is trying to accomplish the same thing that contemporary scientists mean when they talk about evolution. And for Vivekananda, although he sort of acknowledges that there's a lot of paths, right? Some of you may be familiar with his model of the 4 yogas. So yes, you can do your jnana yoga, right? Yes, you can do your karma yoga, of course, right? But actually all of these methods in their own way have underlying them this idea of the energy of Kundalini within the body. Enlightenment for Vivekananda can only come about through the power of Kundalini. It doesn't like me clicking. Okay, there we go. I think I figured it out. So from Vivekananda, let's jump to Paramahansa Yogananda, who comes to the US roughly 25 years after Vivekananda does. And in very real ways is influenced by Vivekananda, right? I mean, grows up in his shadow, for lack of a better word. Now, some of y'all might actually be more familiar with Yogananda than Vivekananda, because of course he's famous for being the face on that orange book that somehow everybody just always encounters. And Steve Jobs gave them out to everybody who came to his house, apparently. And so Yogananda, in a sense, is coming from a very similar context culturally that Vivekananda is. Yogananda was actually born in Uttar Pradesh, but he spent a lot of his childhood in and around Calcutta. And so he's grounded in the same kind of Bengali cultural milieu that Vivekananda was, except with yet another qualification. There's some debate among scholars whether or not Vivekananda was ever initiated by Ramakrishna into any kind of lineage of practice. Vivekananda clearly knew a lot about the literature and about the philosophical concepts that he was dealing with. We don't know whether or not he actually practiced what he taught at some of his workshops, for instance, when he talks about these various kind of hatha yogic methods to raise Kundalini. And we certainly don't know whether or not he learned that stuff from Ramakrishna. It's very realistic that this is something that Ramakrishna would have known about in practice, but for various historical reasons, Vivekananda is just not sort of as embedded in that lineage of practice as Yogananda is in his. Yogananda was initiated into this method of practice called Kriya Yoga for the first time when he was 8 years old. Both of his parents belonged to this lineage as well. And if we look at what Yogananda actually sort of, again, teaches, even more so than the basic outlines of what we see in Vivekananda's work, Yogananda is essentially teaching a method of hatha yoga, right, the sort of physical yoga, that is targeted at the raising of Kundalini. And so if you look at Yogananda's text, and if you visit the Self-Realization Fellowship today, as with Vivekananda, there's a lot of talk of Vedanta. There's also a lot of talk of Christianity. If you look at the altar, you'll see Jesus and Krishna side by side. And we should take this as seriously as we take seriously the fact that Vivekananda called his organization the Vedanta Society, right? These ingredients are not sort of superficial or incidental to what's going on here. But again, if you look at the practice itself, it all sort of comes back to this idea that the way we get to our ultimate goal is through the raising of Kundalini. So this comes from not the autobiography of a yogi, which is a text that Yogananda is most known for. This is actually from a book that's published as a book posthumously called The Second Coming of Christ. So it gives it another sort of interesting spin here. But in this particular passage, we can very clearly see how it is that Yogananda is talking about Kundalini as being at the center of essentially how he imagines, right, this like spiritual advancement. And since we're sort of speeding through this, I won't focus on every bit of the quote. But if you just sort of skim through what's going on here, if you know anything about the standard historical models of Kundalini, this is essentially it, right? We're talking about all this sort of these ideas of vibration, right? Cosmic vibration that you would find, for instance, not just in tantric models of Kundalini in general, but in non-dual Kaula traditions in particular. And if you read it through that lens, suddenly Yogananda begins to make a lot more sense. Now, as as with Vivekananda, what's interesting about Yogananda is the way that he again sort of updates and reframes this process in light of modern or contemporary, at least, science. Yogananda has a lot of really interesting terminology in his work. For instance, one term that he uses for prana is actually life trance, which I mean, he recognizes is not sort of a scientific term, right? But he very much views what's going on within his practice, what's going on within the body, as being fully commensurate with how science sort of talks about human advancement. And so here's another example of him talking about the way that what happens during Kriya Yoga is actually about sort of raising this life energy upwards through the 6 spinal centers, right? Again, effectively the chakras, although he talks about them as nerve plexuses. And the ways in which this is associated, as it was for Vivekananda, with this process of evolution, right? Now, Yogananda actually gets, interestingly, even more precise than Vivekananda does, because I think he has a little bit more source material to work with, quite frankly. If you look at how other teachers within his lineage talk about this, this is a very sort of traditional way of thinking about how it is that sort of manipulating these energetic processes within the body is actually able to kind of transform not just the body, but consciousness itself, right? Essentially, what Yogananda argues about Kriya Yoga, what we can kind of see here, is that the practice literally speeds up time for the practitioner. Now, if you sort of look at the classical pre-modern literature, you see the same thing, but it looks a little bit different than what Yogananda is advocating here. For instance, instead of this correspondence with the 12 astral signs of the zodiac, those teachers and texts talk more about the sort of sun and moon cyclical kind of almost revolution, right? When they talk about how time is sped up, the logic behind this is that actually you're sort of progressing through the yugas, through the cosmic ages, in order to, because time is cyclical, get back to not the Kali Yuga, right, which we're in now, which is kind of the worst one, but the first Yuga, the Yuga where sort of everybody was enlightened and everything was great, right? And so by speeding up the process of time, you're speeding up the cosmic cycle for yourself. And through that mechanism, you're sort of bringing yourself to a higher state of existence. Now, with Yogananda, it's essentially the same logic, except that now, again, he's talking about this kind of progressive version of evolution, and he's did the zodiac in for the sun and the moon for some very specific reasons that we won't go into right now. But effectively, right, you can kind of see the way that he puts it. Half a minute of Kriya practice, right, this sort of physical thing that you do with the body, equals 1 year of natural spiritual unfoldment. So the more you do your Kriya Yoga, the more your sort of organism is going to speed up the natural process of evolution that's going on for the entire human species, that much closer to enlightenment, right? So let's step back for a second and kind of review the common threads that we see here. With both Yogananda and Vivekananda, we've seen their incorporation of this sort of scientific language, this language of evolution, right? And we've seen that language married with, again, not just sort of modern understandings of how these concepts might work, but in important ways with specifically Western concepts of how these things might work. So here I'm going to take a little bit of a sidestep and talk about why we might want to think about Kundalini, right, in this sort of reinterpreted form as still being central to what we're doing in modern postural yoga practice, even though we might not be using that language. Vivekananda is famously sort of said to have not liked Hatha Yoga very much. As you can see in this quote here, right, we have nothing to do with it here. Now there's a lot of reasons for this, some of which I've already mentioned, right? Like it doesn't help him just from a PR perspective to call what he's doing Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga would have been associated, what is it doing? With this specific ascetic type of practice, which is not an inaccurate association historically, right? But he's doing something else here, because notice what he says in this highlighted section. Many of these practices, he says, you'll find in Delsarte and other teachers. Now, this may not look like anything to all of y'all, but this would have been a big red flag for Vivekananda's audience, because they would have all heard the term Delsarte. In terms of kind of its popularity, Delsarte was the sort of white lady yoga of that day, right? He's calling it Delsarte, he might as well be calling it, like, I don't know, Lululemon or something. But Delsarte was more than this, right? Because it wasn't just a brand, it was a whole system. And it was a system that was based on very analogous principles to the ones that we find in South Asian tantric traditions. Insofar as we have some sort of domestic practice that's already going on here, a lot of it has these interesting points of convergence, right? I mean, what it is that spiritual people are doing in the West has these points of convergence with how it is that Yogananda and Vivekananda would have been talking about Tantra in their own contexts. It really just doesn't like me. Just very quickly, let's take a look at one of the most prominent teachers of this stuff that would have been called Delsarte at the end of the 19th century. This is Genevieve Stebbins. And actually, even though we don't have time to talk about her very much today, she arguably is right up there with Yogananda and Vivekananda as far as what the shape of modern yoga comes to be. If you want to learn more about that, Magdalena Crawler has a really, really excellent book looking at pranayama that essentially sort of puts Stebbins on par with any of these sort of modern innovators of yoga. But looking at the highlighted sections, you might begin to see some similarities to what we've already reviewed, at least in Vivekananda. Now, she's using language that's a little bit different, right? She's talking more about magnetism than electricity. But no, although electricity comes up as well, but look specifically at this language of treating the body as a battery, right? And then what is it that this is supposed to do? Essentially, you're working with the energy within the body, and you're looking to concentrate it, right? To put it at the behest of the will, and to send it to wherever it is in the organism that it's needed. So this is Genevieve Stebbins. Yep. Oh my God, there we go. This is Vivekananda. What is it that we accomplish when we breathe? Well, right, the sort of energy, the motions of the body become perfectly rhythmical, and the body becomes a gigantic battery of will. Now, this is published 4 years after Stebbins, right? So we can at least sort of establish some chronology there. And what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Well, ultimately, we're trying to raise the Kundalini, right? But what does this look like? Well, when this rhythmic action in the body forms, center, to control all the other centers, to effectively, by turning the body into a gigantic battery of will, allow you to do with the body whatever it is that you want. Now, this operates on a kind of quotidian level, might be living your best life, but it also has spiritual significance. And it had that spiritual significance for Stebbins as well. So when Vivekananda sort of dismisses Delsarte, right? Oh, it doesn't have any spiritual significance. This wouldn't have actually necessarily been compelling to anybody that was familiar with Delsarte, at least the kind that was taught by innovators like Stebbins. The reason that Vivekananda feels the need to name this stuff isn't so much that he's necessarily presenting something so different. It's that he's presenting something that's actually pretty similar. And he needs to differentiate himself, right? Stebbins is competition for Vivekananda. And I'm not trying to paint this as some sort of like nefarious marketing move that he's engaging in, right? He has good reasons to be doing what he's doing. But he's also got a very strong understanding of his audience and how it is that he needs to differentiate himself from the likes of Stebbins in order for his audience to find his method both similar enough that it's approachable and different enough that it is actually offering something new, right? And one of the ways that it's offering something new is to actually sort of give a very specific name to this power. For Stebbins, it's ether, it's spirit, it's whatever. For Vivekananda, it's Kundalini. It's the serpent power, right? And that has not just maybe sort of a sexier branding to it, but it's got a kind of philosophical scaffolding that actually doesn't necessarily exist in the same way within a system like Delsart. And people find it compelling, right? Especially when it's paired with these, with the evolutionary language that both he and Yogananda use. Yogananda, in a sense, is maybe even a smarter marketer than Vivekananda was. Rather than just saying like, oh, well, y'all have this in Delsart, we're not going to talk about that. Vivekananda or Yogananda doesn't mention Delsart. He actually just sort of absorbs the stuff into his own system. If you look at Yogananda's energization exercises that are still taught by the SRF today, they look a heck of a lot like the energizing exercises that you find in Genevieve Stebbins' book. Now, is there a reason for that? Of course, right? The same as it is for Vivekananda. Yogananda knows his audience. And some of this is strategic, right? Some of this is marketing. But some of it is also coming out of the fact that there are genuine parallels between these two systems. And they're able to talk to the audience that they're facing in ways that the audience finds compelling. So we only do have time. I know we started.
Been pretty soon.
Okay, so we're actually going to sort of skip a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, but we'll just mention them really briefly. How does this bring us up to modern day? Well, one thing that you see among both Western teachers like Stebbins and global yogis like Vivekananda and Yogananda is this kind of not just scientific, right, but like biophysical, so both biological and physical language that's increasingly being assigned to these concepts. And so if we look at other yogis, like for instance, kuṇḍalinī, whom some of you may be familiar with, we see this sort of similar tendency to sort of biologize, to physicalize this originally sort of pretty transcendent concept, right? So Vivekananda was famous for running essentially experiments for what it is that yogic techniques did within the body. And one thing that he does really interestingly is actually sort of split the way that yogic practice works into two components. When it comes to asana practice, he deals with meditative poses and he deals with what he calls cultural poses. Or seated, right? That's where you do pranayama. Cultural poses are what you would do if you walked into core power yoga today. Now, both of these are important for Vivekananda, but they do slightly different things, right? And in a certain sense, the cultural poses are not necessarily less important for the ultimate goals of yoga, which for him, as you might see in that last quote there, still deal with raising Kundalini. But they work on, or they work towards that goal in different ways, right? They work towards that goal by manipulating the physical body, right? In ways that maybe have energetic effects, but really focus on the physical dimension. The same thing we can see in Swami Shivananda, who in this context perhaps is most famous for having actually written a book called Kundalini Yoga. Now what's really interesting is the difference between Shivananda's Kundalini Yoga and his other text that's published about 3 years away called Yoga Home Exercises. Kundalini Yoga, if you read the thing, looks basically like a synthesis of the medieval literature. You have your bandhas, you have your mudras, you have Kundalini, you have the whole shebang. Yogic home exercises looks like what you would do at core power yoga today. Now, I'm bringing up core power. I go to core power, right? I'm not saying this to like denigrate the thing, but it's different than what you would do if you were to like follow the Hatha Yoga Pradipika to the letter. So by sort of, in a sense, divorcing to some extent these two aspects from one another, right? The kind of more metaphysical elements of Kundalini that are really culturally embedded from the physical elements that are all about the way that we manipulate the body, it makes it easy to ignore the way that the physical stuff really is still aiming towards Kundalini awakening, right? The way that those practices still sort of are the second prong that are working towards the same goal. On the other hand, it makes it easier for these practices to blend with the stuff that's already going on in Europe and North America that were not sort of originally yogic, right, that have more to do maybe with stuff that Genevieve Stebbins taught. But by virtue of now being sort of dissolved into this like kind of common language of body perfection, the practice is able to continue, right? The sort of ideological scaffolding is able to continue without the sort of precision of talking about Kundalini, right? We're still perfecting the body. It's the physical body, maybe it's more than the physical body, but the logic of how becomes a little bit fuzzier. And then the last thing that I want to mention, which is maybe the most sort of straightforward and obvious reason for why we don't talk about Kundalini in modern yoga, is actually in a sense historically the most boring. Well, in and of itself, it's really interesting, but because we're definitely out of time, I'm not gonna so much go into the interesting parts of it. But I say it's the most boring because it's the most straightforward. And it goes back to this guy who was responsible for the percentages that were funky, right? But more than half of the postural yoga that we practice globally, and especially in the West today. Tirumala Krishnamacharya. If you've done Ashtanga, it goes back to Krishnamacharya. If you've done a Iyengar, it goes back to Krishnamacharya. If you've done any of these blended styles, in significant ways, they go back to Krishnamacharya. And so the interesting thing about Krishnamacharya, and so therefore his students, is that they come from a very specific cultural context, and it's very different from the cultural context that Yogananda and Vivekananda came from. They are South Indian Brahmins, and they mostly belong to a lineage that if we wanted to kind of like give it a parentage, those of you that are versed in kind of Indian religion and philosophy, it's closely associated with Ramanuja's Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, right? So this is Vaishnava, it's qualified non-dualism, and it's heavily devotional. We can find a tantric component there, it would be Pancharatra Tantra, but Pancharatra is very different from the Kaula stuff that we find in Bengal, right? So what does Krishnamacharya say when he's asked about Kundalini? Kundalini is simply physical. Now, why is he saying this? Well, we've seen some compelling reasons for why he might say Kundalini is simply physical, right? In the 50s or whatever it is that he's giving this interview. If a person controls a nadi, right? If a person controls an energetic channel, he controls Kundalini. This is not important. Kundalini yoga is not yoga at all. There's a lot going on here, right? At the very least, it helps explain why, if you're in a Krishnamacharya lineage, you're not really talking about raising Kundalini. It plugs into the ways that Kundalini methods have become physical over the course of the 20th century, right? I mean, he's not sort of getting that out of nowhere, but for him, this is a criticism. And if we wanted to get even sort of more in depth with this, we could go all the way back to those discrepancies within how Kundalini is presented that I talked about at the very, very beginning. Remember how in some medieval texts, Kundalini is an obstruction, and in other texts, Kundalini is the thing that you need to raise to achieve enlightenment? Well, historically speaking, in the lineage and the cultural context that Krishnamacharya is most readily embedded in, Kundalini is an obstruction. It wouldn't have been central to the methods of yoga that belong to his context. And so of course it's not central for him or for his students, right? It's just a different system. But because what I call the Mysore monopoly is sort of responsible for quite a bit of the postural yoga that we do today, it makes perfect sense why this language of Kundalini is just sort of not central to how it is that we talk about, even when we talk about energy in this context, right? How we understand what that energy is or what it's doing within the body. So I think we'll sort of wrap up there, and hopefully we have like 5 minutes for questions or something. The takeaway, I think, is that the more things change, the more they stay the same in a sense, right? We're still talking about methods of perfection, actually through all these contexts, even in Krishnamacharya's context. But hopefully through going through all these different versions of Kundalini today, I've at least shown y'all how the language of perfection changes, right? it's important to rouse some serpents maybe. But what we understand those serpents to symbolize can be pretty different from context to context. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. I think we could take some minutes for questions, just if anybody does have to leave. I know our class technically ends, so if you need to leave, please do. But if you can stay and we'll ask some questions. And yeah, if you have questions online, feel free to put them in the chat and I will ask them. And if anybody here has questions, go ahead.
If Kundalini isn't yoga, then how does Krishnamacharya define yoga? You know,
You know, I mean, because Krishnamacharya didn't go around publishing a lot of stuff, right? And I certainly have not studied with Krishnamacharya himself. I can't answer that question in detail, but I think it's helpful to look at folks like Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois. I mean, for them, I think Simon Atkinson's done a lot of really good work on this. I mean, Elizabeth DeMichaelis kind of deals with this. The postural yoga is devotional in a sense, right? It's just, it's sort of turning the body into a temple. It's turning the physical practice into an instrument of bhakti. And so, I mean, it gets more complicated, right? Because they also have the need to bring Patanjali into it. In a sense, I think Patanjali is a more natural fit for them. But it's just a more dualistic system in some ways. And in other ways, when it deals with these sort of logics of energy, it's just, right? Iyengar is especially interesting in this context because he actually talks about Kundalini a bit in Light on Yoga. But by the time that he gets to Light on Pranayama in these later texts, if he mentions Kundalini at all, it's actually sort of to dismiss it. So you get the sense that they sort of are aware of this broader conversation, right? The standard model that was put forth by folks like Yogananda and Vivekananda. But for them, yoga really is reinterpreted through this sort of just different lens, and it is more of a bhakti lens. That kind of makes sense?
yeah, thank you.
I was actually reading that Krishnamacharya took a lot from Kalari, from the martial arts. So that's where a lot of that movement came from, through the martial arts of Kalari. So that was really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Has anyone done any sort of comparative analysis of Kalari and the Kuṇḍalinī? Because I know they're similar with the points in the body.
So not Kundalini that I am aware of, but I know, so there was just a conference on, kind of various movement methods within South Asia, like maybe within the last couple of years. Jerome Armstrong's done some really good work on, sort of martial arts and various other physical methods in yoga. But I think he's doing more with, again, that kind of Bengali context. I think if the work is not out there yet, my suspicion is that it's coming soon.
It's hard to get into. It is truly a transmission. It's really hard to get into those schools. I think actually Shiva Ray did it. She's one of the only Westerners who's done that full school down south. Down south.
Oh, you know who else you might look at? Lily Mae Constantini. I know she's done some stuff with martial arts. And she actually, we were just on a panel together. She actually did sort of begin the work of connecting it to Kundalini. And so I haven't read the larger thing. So I don't know if this was like sort of was developing just for that panel, or whether she has done sort of something deeper within it. But she's at least definitely thinking about that explicitly. Just like
What's her name?
Lucy Mae Constantini. She's part of the that big Muntrums thing that's at I think a lot of them are at University of Vienna now. Or she is in any sense.
I never heard, my teacher, I never heard him speak about Kundalini, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't know, like Iyengar, because he had these like things that he published to be, sort of manuals, right? Like on yoga, he's forced to deal with it, to my knowledge. I mean, I'm not familiar with Joyce dealing with it. But he also didn't sort of, right? There's no like equivalent to Light on Yoga for him. So I think he never felt the pressure.
He wrote Yogamala,
That's
which
right,
has his sort of synthesis of.
Yeah,
But I don't
yeah.
think
If somebody else may be aware if he ever at least like mentioned it in a dismissive sense. I wasn't even able to find that in the in the sort of.
Spiros, you spoke with the Japanese about Kundalini. Interesting. That makes sense.
You know, Simon Atkinson has that like sort of very elaborate account of Krishnamacharya and Kundalini, which, I mean, he tries really hard, right? But ultimately he's forced to come to the sort of same conclusion that like, I mean, obviously it's there, but it's kind of not the priority.
Yeah.
And you can, you know, kind of dig into the material that shows a lot of these sort of like thematic continuities, but yeah, it's just not their lineage.
We have a few questions online. And yes, you will all get the recording afterwards. I'm going backwards. Let's see, wait, hold on. The first question, was Krishnamacharya coming from a Shiva lineage? And
So no, and you know what, I actually look at my notes, which I now haven't done the entire time. I can tell you exactly the name of, like at least like the thing to look up if you want to understand a little bit. And I think Iyengar and Patabi Joyce both to some extent. Who is it? Is it Patabi Joyce that does this?
Trace with an invite then.
Yeah. Iyengar. So both Krishnamacharya and Iyengar actually evoke Nath Muni, who's an Alvar, right, Vaishnava poet saint, as being sort of, you know, spiritual inspiration. I think D. Michaelis has made this argument sort of pretty thoroughly. Vishishta Advaita Vedanta would be the thing to look at, and that classically is sort of Vaishnava, right, in its leanings. And yeah, I mean, they're all sort of like all three of them, and Krishnamacharya in particular as the one that started it. I mean, effectively, they're South Indian Brahmins, right? And so, like, even when, like, I know Patabi Joyce leans a little bit more Advaita, right? And
He grew up in a Shankaracharya. Like
Yeah.
That,
So obviously, yeah, there's sort of Shaiva, right? Like non-dual affiliations there. My sense is what that looks like in South India is just sort of like substantively different than what would have looked like in Bengal, right? And so I think that accounts for some of the difference too. See, I'm looking at my notes here, but for some reason I can't find the specific term that I was looking for. In any case.
we have a couple more on here, but go for it.
I have a question, yeah. I know, from what I know in yoga philosophy, many times when they refer to things happening in the body, they mirror or they resonate something happening outside, like the elements or, you know, the centers of energy, etc. So I wonder about this coiled energy inside of it that's about to erupt sometime. Is that talked about or mentioned as similar to something outside, like volcanic power or something like that?
So yes, for sure. And actually, I think there's so many of those correlations, depending on the level that you're interested in, that like it's almost kind of impossible to name all of them right now. So I think the most basic form of what you're referring to is this idea of kind of like the microcosm, right? Like the little world that is the body,
Right.
and the macrocosm, so like the actual cosmos. And so in yogic philosophy and Indian philosophy more broadly, often we do see this idea that like one corresponds to the other, right? One mirrors the other, as you said.
Right.
So in terms of Kundalini, there's a couple of ways that this works. The biggest and most important one is kind of what I briefly described in my talk, which is that like insofar as Kundalini is the goddess, right? The idea is that like the fabric of reality, right? Like as reality forms itself into physical manifestation, it kind of like trickles down, right, to this most concrete thing, which is still the goddess, right? Which is still Shakti ultimately. But it kind of, in the human body, it comes to rest at the bottom of the spine. Because it moves in this, I mean, they imagine this in this kind of spatial manner, right? And so, yeah, in a sense, like Kundalini is the thing that weaves its way through as reality materializes, right? To kind of settle in this sort of most base form, right? In this grossest concrete form. And then, whether we want to talk about kind of human enlightenment or we want to talk about like the end of the cosmic age, it goes back up the other way, right? So in the same way that at the beginning of the cosmic age, reality kind of forms itself, right? Like matter becomes more and more concrete. At the end of the cosmic age or through yogic meditations, you're in a sense kind of like collapsing the grosser levels of reality into the more subtle ones. And so this is the Kundalini rising, right? It's you working your way back up through the formation of the universe. Now we could talk about this in a more literal way. So for instance, insofar as like, this is all also connected to the literal outside world. Sometimes the chakras, so these various places, right, that are both visionary and literal within the body, are correlated to like the different pittas, the seats of Shakti, that are like geographically just temples out there in the world. So there's this sort of important, like almost like socio-political correspondence. And then there's a really, maybe the last thing I'll mention, just because you talked about like volcanoes and like eruptions.
And that's what came to my mind, like what could be a dormant power within nature that would erupt?
Yeah, so alchemy. Alchemy is the other really interesting place where this shows up, because the feminine principle is sulfur, right? It's that fiery sort of stuff that when you mix it with mercury, like interesting things happen.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, the way that this sort of all works out on a chemical level is actually sort of, I mean, like it has its own existence just as chemistry, right? That it doesn't necessarily always have these spiritual correlates. But yeah, for sure, right? These links are everywhere.
Thank you.
A couple more questions for you online. If you want to answer a couple, or we can.
Y'all are committed. You're like,
Can I read them and then you can answer them?
sure,
quickly, or-
yeah.
One from-
We'll go quick.
And then we will let you let you off the seat. One from John Connell, who wants to know, how does it relate to perfection? And is it relating to enlightenment or awareness? And then one from Paul. And lots of lovely comments about your talk also online. What's your sense of how the contemporary criticism of Kundalini and 3HO impacts our abilities to think, talk seriously about the history of Kundalini now? And then he says, I ask just because it seems to me that historians always have to wrestle with ambient assumptions about their topics. Do these contemporary critiques of these movements, also the case with ambient assumptions about Tantrism, create obstacles to your research?
So yeah, just I guess real quick to the first question. I mean, I think that in a sense is the large I'm trying to make, right? Even in the sense that it's like cross-cultural, this focus on perfection, and what it looks like is different between modern day versus, you know, the 8th century. But ultimately, I think that's the common thread, right? Like again, insofar as there's this continuity of concepts between modern and pre-modern yoga, we are still talking about perfection. We're talking about enlightenment. And just because, you know, sometimes that gets interpreted in maybe more superficial ways, right? Like it's just physical perfection, I think doesn't even necessarily negate the larger picture. Maybe in that case, we're just looking at a piece of it rather than sort of the larger whole. But yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of the key thread, right? That runs through the whole thing. These are methods of sort of, you know, whether through energetic methods, whether through meditational methods, whether through physical methods, of making the body, the mind, consciousness, right, the self. I don't want to say something sort of better, right? But something that is closer to that kind of perfect essence that I think these systems sort of understand as underlying reality, especially in the non-dual systems, right? It's like, I mean, like everything is already, whether it's Brahman or Shakti or however you want to call it. But it's like, why are we down here suffering, right? Like, why don't we already know that? Well, because there's some stuff we might want to work through. And so I think that's what all these methods are kind of trying to do. To Paul's question, because we haven't started like really talking about the book yet, right? Like now I think we're going to go into all these podcasts and stuff. And yes, I'm expecting the first question we're going to get is going to be about Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga. In fact, it's like even preempting that, right? If you look at the preface or like the introductory chapter to our book, one of the first subheaders, because it's like we can't really say what the book is about other than it's about Kundalini. We have all these subheaders that are like, what is the book not about? Well, the first thing it's not about is Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini. And obviously it's a little bit about that. But yeah, like Yogi Bhajan is like 1/5 of one chapter. Because just the topic is so much bigger than that, right? And I think we did that very intentionally because like we want to sort of put our foot down on the idea that the topic is much bigger than that. But I expect that as like an entry point into what the stuff is. Like, yeah, we're gonna need to sort of really like press on like, oh look, it's in the preface. And ultimately, I think that like because actually Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini yoga is really substantively different from a lot of these other models of Kundalini. It shows like the flexibility, right? And the power to some extent of the concept, right? Because there's a reason that he adopts that concept, even though he's coming from this sort of like Sikhi framework, where I mean, historically, maybe it wouldn't have been the most natural fit. There's a lot of interesting stuff as somebody that's definitely not an expert on Sikhism that I think happens for instance, with the way that even in the historical literature, like the idea of Amrita is used, right? I mean, insofar as like just there's like geographic continuities with some of the stuff, like of course it's related. But I think that like that only accounts for about half of why Yogi Bhajan chooses to use Kundalini in particular, right? Insofar as he's interacting with this concept that I just described, he's part of this larger framework, right? Where Kundalini is, in a sense, like the calling card for yoga through a significant portion of its kind of early history in the West. And so I think that like it'll be an interesting needle to thread to, I guess, speak to the substance of Paul's question. Because it's like, yes, we absolutely need to like acknowledge all that history. But I think like part of the ideological push for both me and Shravana is to insist that like the history is actually a lot bigger. And like we might want to talk about all of that, right? And in a sense, obviously that has sort of like political and ethical implications as well, right? Like there's no one owner of Kundalini yoga. And in that context, it maybe becomes even more important to insist on this.
Can I just ask one last question? I know we're all here, we might as
Jay,
well.
maybe you'll come back for yoga day and
Yeah.
who's coming?
So I wanted to draw a little bit of line between a recent talk that we had a few months ago by Novetzky and Kale
Oh,
that defines yoga in terms of power, and talk about Shravana's contribution to the book, which is sort of an inversion of power and womanhood, and sexuality is power over, but also sexuality as power from underneath over. And I wonder if that you wanted to speak a little bit to those themes, power and sexuality.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's another thing that so after this book is not about Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini yoga, the next subheader is this book is not about sex. And I think actually, like in an interesting way, for Shravana, that was something that was important to say, right? Specifically because for her, both as a scholar and as a practitioner, sexuality is this really fraught thing. Where especially in her ethnographic field work, right? So she was dealing with some of these sort of very marginalized female practitioners, where sexuality is the thing that's used to sort of bludgeon them by society, right? To discredit not only their practice, but sort of them as social beings. And so I think a lot of, kind of what her ethnographic material brought to this book, and then also the work that she is sort of more largely doing, that's kind of based on the stuff that she did for her thesis that really deals with these female practitioners, is about this really difficult role of sexuality as power. Right? Because yes, of course, like the power, I mean, whether it's personally, whether it's metaphysically, right? Like sort of, especially in that context, arises from the sexual ritual. But on the other hand, whether it's socially, whether it's politically, whether it's again, sort of personally, right? Insofar as some of these women were initiated into these lineages, into these practices when they were children still. I mean, I think Shravana will say this sort of pretty outright, like it's abuse on some level. And so what do you do with that, right? And I think the only thing that you can do is it's kind of both and, right? Like, yes, there's that power over, that sexuality is used to exert, right? Including those really gnarly kind of just like straight up abusive elements. But then, yeah, there is also a sense of personal agency that then becomes a channel for. And I think this is the other thing that Shravana will talk about that I really, really love. And this is maybe more her as a practitioner. And I mean, since she's pretty public with this position on Tantra, I don't think that I'm sort of speaking out of turn here. For her, Tantra is, I think she calls it kind of absolute sovereignty. Right. And so it absolutely is kind of empowerment in all the conceivable ways. And so I think like for both of us, it was really useful to keep both sides of the equation in mind, right? Especially when something as fraught as sexuality comes into the picture, that like it's never one or the other, right? Like, I mean, that's the non-dual ethos, right? It's like you gotta kind of take both and smush them together and just sort of accept what the thing is. Cool.
Thank you.
Yay!
Thank you, everybody, for joining us and staying, and come back next time.
What is the ukulele thing? I know you talked about it in the beginning, but I was like sort of.
No, I was